centered in Istanbul, in modern-day Turkey. He reigned from 1520 to 1566, to the time of his death. Suleiman was one of the greatest military conquerors of the Ottoman Empire. He took Islam to the very threshold of Europe. He conquered Belgrade. He took the island of Rhodes. He was at the doorstep of Vienna when he was finally defeated in the siege of Vienna in 1529 and prevented Europe from becoming part of the Ottoman Empire and a Muslim domain. And it was also Suleiman who restored the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem that we saw today. He built the Jerusalem city walls. He built in the 1520s the Golden Gate and sealed it up so that the Messiah would not be allowed to enter through that gate. So the Jerusalem that we see today, at least in the walls, is largely the creation of this Ottoman ruler, Suleiman the Magnificent. The Jerusalem of Jesus' day lies for the most part buried several meters below the surface. And so although we do see some first century remains in Jerusalem, we need to use our imagination as we look at Jerusalem to try to think of what it would look like in Jesus' day. And I thought the model that we saw of the city at the time of Jesus was extremely helpful in enabling us to envision what it must have looked like then to stand on the Mount of Olives and look across the Kidron Valley at that magnificent Temple Mount and the Jerusalem that Jesus saw. But what can we know historically about Jesus and Jerusalem? Revisionist critics today claim that the Gospels are historically inaccurate insofar as they portray Jesus' crucifixion as the result of instigation by the chief priests of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and then merely carried out by the Roman authorities. The revisionists like to claim instead that ultimately it was the Roman authorities, not the temple priesthood or authorities, who are responsible for Jesus' crucifixion. They point out that during the time of Jesus there was great unrest in Palestine, and that with hundreds of thousands of visitors in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover, the Roman authorities must have been extremely anxious to maintain the public peace. Nerves, they say, must have been on edge. Extra-biblical sources, such as we read from Philo on Monday night, portray Pilate as a cruel and ruthless man who would not hesitate to bring the soldiers down on the Jewish population in order to keep the order. The temple priesthood of Jesus' day were basically collaborators with Rome who were in cahoots with Pilate in order to keep things under control. Revisionist critics interpret Jesus' act of cleansing the temple as an attack on the temple itself, on the institution of the temple and its authorities. So Jesus wasn't just disturbing the peace in their view, but rather the Jewish priesthood in the temple felt that their authority was under attack by Jesus' actions. Pilate was about to bring his fist down hard on the civilian population in order to keep the order, and Caiaphas knew that this would have resulted in a great loss of innocent life. And so in order to preserve the peace, and because he felt his own authority threatened by Jesus, Caiaphas decided to deliver Jesus over to the Roman authorities rather than to allow innocent people to be killed in a crackdown by the Roman government. And so the responsibility on the revisionist view for Jesus' crucifixion really lay at the feet of the Roman authorities, not the Jewish authorities, as the Gospels say. Now, what can we say in assessment of this revisionist picture? Well, I think before we look at it in some detail, it's important not to miss the forest for the trees. What's remarkable here, I think, is really the degree of agreement between the revisionist critics and traditional scholars with regard to Jesus' passion and the last week of his life. Even the revisionist critics affirm the historicity of the central events of Jesus' passion. For example, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey as a herald of the kingdom of God in fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy. Jesus' disruptive action in the temple, driving out the money changers and their animals. The involvement of the Jewish authorities, in some way at least, in Jesus' hearing or trial before them. Jesus being delivered over to Pontius Pilate on charges of sedition, and Pilate's condemning Jesus to be crucified as a pretended king of the Jews. And I think it's really stunning testimony to the credibility of the gospel narratives that even these revisionist, radical critics feel compelled by the evidence to admit the historicity of the central events of the last week of Jesus' life. Their main point of contention seems to have to do with whether it was the Jewish authorities ensconced in the temple or the Roman authorities who were chiefly responsible for Jesus' death. Now, some of you might be thinking at this point, who cares? After all, traditionalist and revisionist critics alike agree on the main events. And it's just pointless now, 2,000 years later, to play the blame game. In fact, you might suspect that this whole dispute is really motivated by a little more than political correctness. It's politically incorrect to blame the Jewish authorities for Jesus' crucifixion. And since there aren't any Romans about anymore to complain, it's easy to let the Romans be the fall guy. Well, I agree that there is a good deal of political correctness, I think, that is driving this debate. But if you think that's the whole story, then I think you've seriously underestimated the significance of the issue. There's a lot more at stake here than first meets the eye. What most folks, I think, don't realize is that the revisionist account of Jesus' arrest and crucifixion is just a part of a broader revisionist picture of Jesus of Nazareth, which these skeptical critics are trying to put through. You see, the skeptical critics reject the gospel portrait of Jesus of Nazareth as a man who claimed to be the unique Son of God and the divine Son of Man, and who thought of himself as the promised Jewish Messiah. According to John Dominic Crossan, Jesus was just a kind of social critic, the Jewish equivalent of a Greek cynic philosopher. Marcus Borg, another revisionist critic, says that Jesus was a cross-cultural religious mystic who championed the rights of women and the poor against an oppressive religious establishment. The supernatural Jesus that we read about in the Gospels is just a product of myth and legend. Now, one of the greatest problems with the revisionist portrait of Jesus is the simple fact of his crucifixion. Everybody agrees that Jesus of Nazareth wound up on the cross. In fact, the revisionist critic Paula Fredrickson says that the crucifixion of Jesus is, and I quote, the single strongest fact we have about Jesus. But if Jesus was just a peasant, cynic philosopher, just a liberal social gadfly, as the revisionists think, then his crucifixion becomes inexplicable. As Professor Leander Keck of Yale University has written, the idea that this Jewish cynic and his dozen hippies with his demeanor and aphorisms was a serious threat to society sounds more like a conceit of alienated academics than sound historical judgment, end quote. John Meyer, a prominent New Testament scholar, is equally direct. He says, and I quote, "Such a Jesus would threaten no one, just as the university professors who create him threaten no one." The revisionist critics have thus created a Jesus who is incompatible with the one indisputable fact about Jesus of Nazareth, namely his death by crucifixion. And it's in light of this problem that the revisionist accounts of Jesus' passion must be seen. Basically, the revisionist account of Jesus' passion and death is an attempt to explain how you get a non-messianic, non-divine Jesus to the cross, which is where everybody admits he wound up. And the way you do it is this. You imagine a scenario in which there was a hair-trigger situation in Jerusalem during Passover that year. The least disturbance could set things off. Pilate is ready to come down, and come down hard on anyone disturbing the peace. That's what Jesus did, and so, as I said, that's what got him handed over to the Roman authorities, who crucified him as a public example of what happens to troublemakers. Now, I think that at first blush, we've got to admit this sounds like a plausible scenario. But plausible scenarios must always be assessed by the evidence. And when we ask, what is the evidence for this revisionist scenario, then what's striking is the almost complete lack of any evidence in favor of this scenario. It is based almost entirely on hunches and conjectures about what one would expect to be likely to happen. So, for example, we hear Paula Fredrickson talking about what she, in my historian's imagination, thinks must have happened. John Dominic Crossan says, I can imagine there was a standing order between Pilate and Caiaphas to arrest anyone who got out of line. And so we're treated to all sorts of imaginative scenarios, speculations about tensions in the Passover crowd, about Pilate's thought and his mood, even about what Caiaphas is thinking to himself. Now, this is really quite extraordinary. This isn't the way you do history. If history could be written on the basis of hunches and conjectures, then professional historians would be out of a job. Life is often not neat and tidy. The course of events will often swing in unexpected directions, and people surprise us by sometimes acting out of character in ways seemingly incomprehensible. Let me give you a wonderful example of this that is so appropriate to our evening here in Jerusalem. And I'm speaking here of the actions of Richard the Lionhearted in Jerusalem at the climactic moment of the Third Crusade. Now, let me give first a little bit of historical background. By the time of the First Crusade, Muslims had ruled Palestine and Jerusalem for over 400 years. They first took the city in the year 637 under the second Caliph Omar. On July 15th of 1099, 400 years later, the first Crusaders conquered Jerusalem. They massacred all of the Jewish and Muslim civilian population, and they pillaged and destroyed the mosques and the city itself. And after gaining control of Jerusalem, the Crusaders created 4 creator states in Palestine. The Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, and then going up the coast, the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Tripoli. So there were these 4 Crusader kingdoms that existed in the Middle Ages here in Palestine. Now, we don't often think of Israel in terms of medieval castles and knights and things of that sort. But in fact, there were about 20 of these medieval European castles that were built here in Israel, and the remains of which you can go visit today. And there were knights here in Israel. There were very interesting monastic orders, that is to say, orders of monks, which were military orders. These monks were soldiers. They were military monks. One group was called the Hospitallers, who were connected with the hospital in Jerusalem. The other were the Knights Templar, connected with the Temple Mount, founded in 1119. And these monastic military orders became the most powerful Christian groups in the area. Well, in the year 1144, the county of Edessa up north was reconquered by the Muslims. And this led the Pope to call for a second crusade. And so French and German armies were marshaled and marched to the Holy Land in 1147, but they failed, in fact, to win any major victories. In 1187, after nearly a century under Christian rule, Jerusalem was reconquered by Saladin, who was the Sultan of Egypt, after the massacre at the Battle of Hattin. And you remember when we were on the coaches coming into Tiberias, our guides pointed out those rocky outcrops called the Horns of Hattin, where these Crusader knights had been lured out into the open, and after marching all day in heavy armor, exhausted by the heat, their throats parched, aching for water, wave after wave after wave of Muslim armies finally encircled these knights and then finally overwhelmed them and killed them. It was a terrible massacre that occurred at the Horns of Hattin. Well, the reports of Saladin's victory shocked Europe. Pope Gregory VIII called for a third crusade. And this crusade was led by some of Europe's most important kings, such as Philip of France, the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick I, and Richard I of England, or Richard the Lionhearted. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Robin Hood or read the story, this is the good King Richard that is off on the Holy Land when the bad King John, remember, is despoiling the English countryside. This is the same guy. This is Richard the Lionhearted, who helped lead the Third Crusade. Well, Frederick drowned on the way to the Holy Land in 1190, and this left a very unstable alliance between the French and the English. Philip then abandoned the crusade a year later in 1191, and that left simply Richard the Lionhearted to lead the Crusaders against Jerusalem. Richard was called the Lionhearted because he was a ruthless warrior. He was a military man to the core, an incredible warrior and soldier and strategist. And the Crusader army arrived in Palestine up north and conquered the city of Acre. And then they fought their way south along the coast, battle after battle. They defeated the Muslims near Arsuf. They then recaptured the port city of Jaffa. They then came within sight of Jerusalem. Saladin knew that he could not hold the city, and therefore he withdrew his armies, and he left only a skeleton force to man the walls of Jerusalem. Finally, one evening, Richard approached the holy city, and there on the hill he saw Jerusalem, the quest that he had come for. It was thinly defended. It was ripe for the taking. This was the culmination of the entire Third Crusade. This was why they had come, why they had sacrificed so much in terms of wealth and men and years of fighting and hardship. Richard, as I say, was a ruthless warrior, a great military man. If a historian knew only this much. Anybody could have predicted what would happen next. But incredibly, this valiant warrior who had come all this way for this one end, suddenly, inexplicably, drew back. He decided not to attack Jerusalem, not to take the city. Instead, he negotiated a peace treaty with Suleiman, which allowed Jerusalem to remain under Muslim control just so long as Christian pilgrims could visit the city unarmed and go to the holy sites. And with that, Richard turned around and went home to England. It was an unbelievable end to the Third Crusade. And that's why, as I say, the historian's picture of the past must always be guided by the evidence, not by what we think should have happened. Now, certainly, imagination does play a role in the historian's reconstruction of the past, but imagination must always be tested by evidence. So, to return to our question then, how does the revisionist scenario of Jesus' passion match up to the evidence? Well, not too well, I think. Take, for example, this crucial conjecture of a hair-trigger tension in Jerusalem during the time of the Passover feast. So tense that the least disturbance would cause the Roman authorities to come down and slaughter even innocent parties. John Dominic Crossan says anything could cause a revolution. You can imagine Pilate saying, if anything moves, crucify him. But does the evidence bear out that conjecture? Well, to the contrary. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem in fulfillment of the messianic prophecy of Zechariah, during which he was hailed by the crowds as the coming Jewish Messiah inaugurating the kingdom of David, didn't elicit a peep from the Roman authorities. After looking around, Jesus turns around and walks back out to Bethany, where he spent the night. The next day, he did disrupt the temple commerce, but no Roman troops sprang into action despite his disruption of the temple precincts. No Roman authorities moved to arrest him, nor in the following days did Roman authorities move against Jesus. He continued to teach every day in the temple and to go back out to Bethany to spend the night with his disciples. The idea that the Roman authorities saw in Jesus of Nazareth some sort of a significant threat to the peace so that they would move against him to arrest him simply contradicts their actual behavior. In fact, when you think about it, meddling in Jewish affairs with a popular teacher might actually create more unrest rather than simply leaving him alone, which is what actually they did. Moreover, there's no good reason to think of Jesus' action in the temple as an attack on the temple itself, rather than as what the Gospels portray it, namely as a cleansing or a purifying of the temple. In the days following his action in the temple, Jesus did not speak out against the temple. On the contrary, he continued to teach there daily. And notice that after his death, his followers continued to worship in the temple, just as ordinary Jews did. This was not a rejection of the institution of the temple as such. Well, what about Jesus' arrest? The evidence unanimously supports the conclusion that Jesus was betrayed into the hands of the Jewish authorities, not the Roman authorities. This is not only attested in all four Gospels, but also in extremely early information which is handed on by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 23. It was, after all, the Jewish authorities, not the Roman authorities, who felt threatened by Jesus' person and teaching and therefore wanted him dead. Nor was this a last-minute decision that was only reached during Passover week. According to two independent sources, Mark and John, the plot to get rid of Jesus had been brewing among the Jewish leadership for some time. Both the Jewish historian Josephus and the Babylonian Talmud testified to the Jewish authorities' involvement and initiative in Jesus' trial. The Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin 43a justifies their seeking his execution as an appropriate action taken against a heretic. Why is this? Well, at his trial before the Sanhedrin, Jesus was sentenced to death for blasphemy. Let me quote from Mark's account in Mark chapter 14. Then the high priest stood up and asked Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. In this saying, Jesus claims to be not only the Messiah, but also the Son of God and the divine human Son of Man prophesied by the prophet Daniel, who will be coming in judgment on the clouds of heaven, virtually a quotation out of Daniel chapter 7. Especially blasphemous in Jewish ears would be his claim to sit at the right hand of God. Now, revisionists don't like this portrait of Jesus. But as Robert Gundry, who is a fine Gospel of Mark scholar, has argued, so subtle an account of a capital blasphemy case in a Jewish setting could not be a later construction. This is an accurate account of Jesus' trial. Now, since the Sanhedrin lacked the authority to carry out capital punishment, the Roman authorities had to be convinced somehow to execute Jesus of Nazareth. And to Roman ears, Jesus claimed to be the king of the Jews would come across as seditious. Remember, at that time, there was no Jewish king in Judea. There were Roman prefects. And so Jesus was therefore cast by the chief priests in the role of a political rebel to Pilate. Revisionists say that the Gospel's portrayal of Pilate as a weak and vacillating man contradicts what we know about his ruthless character, as described, for example, by Philo of Alexandria. But I think that the Pilate that we read about in the Gospels is not weak and vacillating. What he exhibits is not weakness, but his characteristic stubbornness in the face of Jewish demands. If Jesus was not arrested by Roman authorities on Roman concerns, but rather was arrested by Jewish initiative on concerns that were primarily Jewish in nature, then Pilate might well resist the temple leaders' efforts to manipulate the Romans into doing away with Jesus. And we know historically that Pilate wasn't afraid to bump heads with the temple authorities, nor afraid to give in when it seemed politic. For example, Josephus tells us that when Pilate arrived in Jerusalem in AD 26 to become the prefect, he deliberately provoked the chief priests by displaying Roman standards with the emperor's image on them in Jerusalem. This was an action which his predecessors had been very careful to avoid, since Jewish religious sensibilities wouldn't permit such images. The Jewish authorities sent a delegation to Pilate, which argued for 5 days to get him to bring down these standards, and he wouldn't do it. On the 6th day, Pilate ominously ordered a detachment of soldiers to infiltrate the Jewish crowd, and then upon signal to unsheath their swords. And at that point, the Jewish delegates bared their necks, saying that they would rather die than violate Jewish law. Whereupon Pilate, realizing that he was on the verge of provoking an uprising, gave in and ordered the standards to be taken down. Now, Pilate's action just 4 years later, in the case of Jesus of Nazareth, follows this same precedent. He stubbornly locks horns with the Jewish leadership until he sees that a riot is about to break out. When the chief priests make the thinly veiled threat, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Then Pilate realizes where his self-interests lie, and he relents and gives them what they want and orders Jesus to be executed. But by giving the crowd a voice in choosing between Barabbas and Jesus, Pilate ensures that the people will not rise up on behalf of Jesus. They have what they want. Revisionists will sometimes say that the crowd's calling for the release of Barabbas is inconsistent with Jesus' popularity. They wouldn't prefer Barabbas. But we don't really know how many sympathizers Jesus had in Jerusalem, nor do we know which people the chief priests had selectively assembled that day to appear before Pilate. And in any case, frankly, Jesus must have appeared something of a disappointment to those who had hailed his triumphal entry earlier in the week and had expected him to take up the throne of David. He hadn't followed up on his triumphal entry or his cleansing of the temple by calling for a Jewish insurrection. On the contrary, in answer to the provocative question about paying taxes to Caesar, Jesus had given the positively anti-revolutionary response: render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Mark 12:17. The bloody and broken image of Jesus, which was presented by Pilate to the crowds, was the very antithesis of the conquering warrior king and Jewish Messiah that they had learned to expect. And it's not at all improbable that Barabbas, the insurrectionist, appeared to them to be a more honest-to-goodness Messiah than did Jesus of Nazareth. Traditionalists and revisionists alike agree that Jesus was then crucified by Roman authority. But what happened to Jesus' body after his death? When I was approached by NBC about being interviewed for a program entitled The Last Days of Jesus, I said that I would do it so long as they would talk about the resurrection of Jesus. But when the producer said, no, we're just going to end the story with the crucifixion, I said to her, well, then you're not really going to be talking about the last days of Jesus, are you? And she said, I see what you mean. If it hadn't been for the resurrection, nobody would really care about the last days of Jesus, would they? Well, that's absolutely right. The resurrection of Jesus is the key to his identity. So, what happened then to Jesus' corpse? John Dominic Crossan surmises that it was probably taken down by the Roman soldiers and thrown into a shallow dirt grave where it either rotted away or was dug up and eaten by dogs. But not only is there no evidence at all for this colorful conjecture, but Jewish burial practices and sensibilities are in direct contradiction to it. In opposition to Crossan's conjecture, let me just summarize 4 facts which are agreed upon by the majority of New Testament scholars who have studied this question. And I'm sure that those of you who know my work could recite these 4 facts yourself. Fact number 1, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. And this fact is highly significant because it means that the burial location of Jesus' body was known in Jerusalem to both Jew and Christian alike. And therefore, any movement in Jerusalem based on belief in the resurrection of the dead man would have been impossible in the face of a tomb containing his corpse. According to John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the honorable burial of Jesus is, and I quote, one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus, end quote. Fact number 2, on the Sunday morning following his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jakob Kramer, who was an Austrian specialist in resurrection studies, and I quote, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. As D.H. Van Dalen puts it, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. He says those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Fact number 3, on multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. This fact is virtually universally acknowledged by New Testament scholars today. Even Count Ludemann, who is perhaps the most prominent critic of the resurrection today, admits, and I quote, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ, end quote. And finally, fact number 4, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Despite every predisposition to the contrary, it is an indisputable fact of history that the original disciples believed in, proclaimed, and were willing to die for the truth of Jesus' resurrection. C.F.D. Moll of Cambridge University concludes that we have here a belief which nothing in terms of prior historical influences can account for apart from the resurrection itself. So, any responsible historian then who wants to give an account of the fate of Jesus of Nazareth must deal with these 4 independently established facts. The honorable burial of Jesus in the tomb, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection from the dead. And I want to emphasize that these are not just the conclusions of conservative or evangelical scholars. This represents the majority view of mainstream New Testament historical scholarship today. So, the question is, how do you best explain these facts? Well, here the skeptical critic finds himself in a rather desperate situation. For example, a few years ago, I had a debate at the University of California, Irvine, with a professor who had written his doctoral dissertation on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, he was thoroughly familiar with the evidence, and he could not deny the facts of Jesus' honorable burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, or the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And so his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of these 4 facts. And so he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an identical twin brother who was separated from him shortly after birth, who grew up independently and happened to come back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion. He stole his brother's body out of the grave and presented himself to the disciples, who mistakenly thought it was Jesus risen from the dead. Now, I'm not going to go into how I went about refuting this theory, but let me just say that I think it's so instructive because it shows what desperate lengths skepticism must go to in order to explain away the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, did you know that the evidence is so good that one of the world's leading Jewish theologians, Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University in Tel Aviv, declared himself convinced on the basis of the evidence that the God of Israel raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. Well, one final historical note on the resurrection of Jesus. The tomb, which lies beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that we visited today, is likely the authentic tomb of Jesus of Nazareth. It's likely this is actually it. And the story of how Jesus' tomb was relocated is fascinating. Here I want to pick up the story that I began Monday night. You remember I described the great persecution by the Roman Emperor Diocletian at the beginning of the 300s. Well, by the end of the Diocletian persecution, there were 4 co-regents of the Roman Empire. There were 2 senior Caesars and then 2 subordinate Caesars. And Constantine, who later became emperor, was the son of one of these 4. He was the son of the Caesar Constantius, who ruled the areas of Britain and Gaul. And Constantius did not pursue the Diocletian persecution as the other co-regents did in their regions. And when his father died, Constantine decreed a formal end to the persecution of Christians in his regions. And he returned to the Christians all of the property and goods that they had lost during the persecution. Well, eventually war among these 4 Roman emperors was inevitable. And when it broke out, in the year 312, Constantine moved with his armies out of Gaul into Italy. And as he approached Rome, the church historian Eusebius says, while marching at midday, and I quote, he saw with his own eyes in the heavens a cross arising from the light of the sun, carrying the message, in this sign you will conquer. The following night, Constantine had a dream in which Christ appeared to him with the same heavenly sign and told him to make a standard for his army in the form of the cross. Well, Constantine then won a very quick victory and was proclaimed Augustus Caesar. And Constantine credited the Christian God for his victory and became the first Roman Empire to embrace Christianity as his own personal religious faith. In the year 313, he and his co-emperor Licinius, as I explained, issued the Edict of Toleration, which officially granted full tolerance to Christians of all religions in the empire. Well, eventually Licinius reneged on the religious freedom that they had promised in the Edict of Toleration and began to persecute Christians again. And that provoked a challenge to Constantine in the west, and this climaxed in a great civil war in 324, in which Constantine finally emerged as the sole emperor of the Roman Empire and the first Christian emperor of that empire. And Constantine was very zealous to promote the Christian faith. For example, it was Constantine who convened the Council of Nicaea a year later in the year 325, which promulgated the famous Nicene Creed. He also told his mother, Helena, that she had unlimited access to the imperial treasury in order to relocate relics of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so between the years 326 and 328, Helena, even though she was in her 70s at this time, like Banks, she was a traveler to Palestine in her 70s, and she went to Jerusalem, and she began to inquire where the tomb of Jesus was located. And the locals in Jerusalem pointed to a spot where a temple to the goddess Aphrodite had stood for over a century. And Eusebius reports that the emperor then ordered the temple to be razed. And then Eusebius goes on to say, nor did the emperor's zeal stop here, but he gave further orders that the materials of what was thus destroyed, both stone and timber, should be removed and thrown as far from the spot as possible. and this command was also speedily executed. The emperor, however, was not satisfied with having proceeded thus far. Once more, fired with holy ardor, he directed that the ground itself should be dug up to a considerable depth, and the soil, which had been polluted by the foul impurities of demon worship, transported to a far distant place. This was also accomplished without delay. But as soon as the original surface of the ground beneath the covering of the earth appeared, immediately, and contrary to all expectation, the venerable and hallowed monument of our Savior's resurrection was discovered. Then indeed did this most holy cave present a faithful similitude of his return to life, in that, after lying buried in darkness, it again emerged into light, and afforded to all who came to witness the sight a clear and visible proof of the wonders of which that spot had once been the scene, a testimony to the resurrection of the Savior, clearer than any voice could give. So here we have a very old tradition as to the location of Jesus' tomb. And it's rendered probable, I think, by two factors. First, the location to which these locals directed Helena was inside the extant walls of the city, even though the New Testament says that Jesus was crucified and buried outside the walls of the city. What the people at that time didn't realize was that the original walls, in fact, lay elsewhere, and that the spot that they had directed her to did lie outside the original walls of the city, which they didn't even know the location of. Secondly, then, this highly improbable event, that digging down, lo and behold, they find the tomb, exactly where the tradition had said it would be. So most scholars think that the tradition of the location of Jesus' tomb beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is likely authentic. This is where the resurrection of Jesus occurred. So, in summary then tonight, the evidence doesn't support the views of the revisionist historians. On the contrary, I think we have solid historical grounds that Jesus of Nazareth not only claimed to be the Jewish Messiah and the divine Son of Man and the unique Son of God, claims which provoked his arrest by the Jewish authorities and ultimately led to his crucifixion, but also I think we have evidence that those claims are true because God raised him from the dead. As the early apostles preached, God would not allow his Holy One to see corruption. God has acted in history and left an empty tomb as a trophy of his victory. Amen.